Can I buy it from you?
You get two. Okay, are we ready to?
We will be in a minute.
I think they can have her name here. And one session.
Oh, really?
People.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, definitely.
I guess it was, I think it was, the Dutch was happening.
Okay, let's call the workshop meeting for the commission to order. Rita, would you take roll, please?
Commissioner Ganger, Commissioner Stanley,
Yes.
Commissioner
Here.
White, Commissioner Horsley, Mayor Morgan.
Yes. Okay, this is a workshop meeting to discuss budget and ad hoc finance committee that we mentioned at our last special meeting. Since that meeting, the town manager has spent quite a bit of time putting together the draft budget for next year, and you've been provided a copy of that. And I must say I'm pleased, having looked at it, to see that the town is in considerably better shape with the proposed budget than it appeared with the current budget last week. But the millage rate is maintained at the current 3.7 rate due to the increase in valuation of property in our community, which just came down. It's an increase of over 12% in values, plus the addition of 4001 high-end condominium community. According to the budget, we can still allocate a very significant amount for legal fees, up to $350,000, which should be ample. Also pay the remaining $421,000 that are going to be obligated on the lighting project, and still have funds that could be put into reserves, at least on the budget, proposed budget, over $100,000. So my point is the urgency of this discussion of an ad hoc committee does not seem present right now. In addition, in calling around, speaking to people over the week, it became quite clear to me that at this late date, many people were leaving for the season, and we would have trouble getting the talent and expertise that we're looking for to focus on this at this time. So my suggestion is that we table the decision on a ad hoc finance committee at this time. We can take it up at a later date when it would be more appropriate. But I would like to bring up a couple matters for budget discussion. Since Mr. Thrasher has spent so much time putting together this draft budget, I think some guidance for him as he prepares the budget for our final decision in September would be helpful to him. That main issue is the millage rate. There was not a decision made when it was raised to 3.7, how long that rate would be in effect. So the question is, do we, as a consensus, without making a firm decision on it right now, are we inclined to keep it at that rate, increase it, or roll it back? The proposed budget for next year contemplates it at the 3.7 millage rate. Any discussion?
Well, for whatever it's worth, I think that the millage rate is the sum of the things that you want to do and the process with which you want to do it. And I think this community has for eternity tried to be as judicious with its taxpayers' property tax funds as it could possibly be, and then to run a very efficient organization, financially, fiscally responsible organization as best we could. And we're, you know, this is a remarkable time in our history when it isn't a natural cause, it isn't a hurricane, but it's an internal matter that is affecting our ability to plan and budget accordingly. I believe as a principle that we should, at the very least, try to maintain the millage where it is, because it is in turn something that we had to bring up. From historically, we try and keep it pretty close to $3, and then, you know, then it went up a little bit, and a little bit. $3.70 is a substantial increase from where we were in the past, but for good and sufficient reasons. I think everyone in the community recognized that we had some housekeeping to do, and that was going to cost some money. And then, of course, when we had encountered the legal situation, you have to deal with what the cards that are on the table. I personally believe that as a if this is called advice to the town manager, that that he should be as honest as he can with himself and try and figure out what is the things that we absolutely have to do, what are the things that we'd like to do, what are some things that we probably could defer. But I also believe that we ought to have the option of freezing some things in our budget. In other words, not spend the money until such time as we have more certainty on the legal front and more certainty on perhaps some other issues, none the least of which is did we get to the summer without a hurricane? I keep looking at this as you know, this is roughly $1 billion asset, this town. And if we have only $700,000 in our reserves, it just doesn't seem right to me. I think we have to continue to work as hard as we can on building our reserves, not only for general operating reasons, but as well on water. I was kind of stunned when I read the water document, and although I wouldn't say that Mr. Harvell's memory is necessarily the best source for the future of the pipes that we have, but common sense says if a pipe is 50 or 60 years old and it's lying in salt, that it's not going to last forever. And the $66,000 we put into the water reserve fund this year pales by the $7 million potential hit when, as and if these pipes have to be replaced. So if it were my personal life, I would be putting money aside for that eventuality, and if I don't spend them, I will be perfectly happy. But if we have to spend it, obviously we're going to have to borrow money at the time we do it, to have the cash in the bank to be able to start the process. I think so that we really have to do. And we can't leave to another generation what's happening in America. We'll let them worry about it. And I don't think that's who we are. I think we're the kinds of people that pay our way. And I think the water fund is an area that I would hope he could really work on. Now that's not a property tax issue. It's not in the village, but it is a price that people have to pay. And I think we ought to just be darn sure that we're putting enough funds aside.
Mr. Thrasher, what's the projected reserve on next year's
A
budget?
build of 150 in water,
In water, sorry.
in water, 150. That's what I anticipate.
Okay.
Well, I
That's
would-
66 planned, and the balance coming 80, 90,000 from performance and
Mhm.
net revenues.
I think that the community should understand that the water manager is one of Mr. Thrasher's finest hours. That he saw an opportunity to be more efficient. He seized upon it. He made some tough decisions or recommendations that the commission agreed to. We are managing our water enterprise fund well, and he should be commended for it. But well is maybe not good enough. Better, maybe better. And I really think there's an area where you just have no control over this. This one of those pipes goes and you know,
That's right.
we could be in really deep ditch. So that's, reserves, continue to be something that I would want to work darn hard to make sure, and if we have to raise the millage a little bit to make sure that there's enough money in reserves, I would favor that, although I don't want to do it and don't think we necessarily have to do it, but we shouldn't walk away from it as a principle.
I think
John?
we used the reserves before on replacing the water main on A1A, and we took it out of our reserves. We've operated a very tight budget in the past, and we usually try to keep $1 million in the fund balance. And it's gone below that just for different reasons, but I think the current millage rate, we are going to get so much new taxable revenue on, I don't think it's necessary to raise it right away. I think,
To raise it beyond
yeah, 3 point.
3.7?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think this year will be necessary, but I agree with Mr. Banger. The water is an issue because our pipes are old. It was something that I pointed out years ago, you know, to start saving money for it, and maybe we're not doing that rapidly enough, but we used to use the fund balance to fund things like that, and now we have our own water.
I mean, another positive aspect here is that the money's being expended for lighting,
Yeah.
you know, just over $400,000. That's going to be a one-year expenditure.
Yeah.
So after that, it's going to be considerably more money coming into the town.
And also the undergrounding just in general has cost the town some money just because of different reasons. And
Well,
so-
town property for one.
Yeah, that's what yeah.
Yep.
But that was like a one-time deal. That's probably why it's a little lower too, because the town had to pay out quite a bit of money. for the-
Tom, what are your thoughts on the millage rate?
Pardon?
What are your thoughts on the millage rate?
I think seeing Bill's budget for the coming year, that he's been successful in with the 3.7, and I would keep it there. He's worked out a budget where we have some excess, and to lower it, that wouldn't be the case. So I agree that it should be kept the same.
Tom?
I meandered through this and I did have a discussion which was supposed to be 10 minutes, but got a little longer with the town manager earlier in the week. But running through this, to what Mr. Mayor, what you said as far as and Commissioner Wertheim about the certain things coming off the budget next year with the additional tax revenue, I definitely don't think that at this time you can lower the millage rate. I had run a few assumptions sort of in my head. The town manager also advised me of what a millage rate increase was. My fractions are right, or my decimals, a 0.1 increase would be about $86,000 in increased revenue. Obviously, I don't think the residents want to pay more, but the threshold question and why we're here is, and that's your directive of setting policy as the mayor, was what about the reserve fund? And we've got some time, which is why we had the meeting here earlier to kind of bring out the issues, get the budget out of the preliminary budget out earlier. Is that with the street lighting, which is $400,000 next year, which you just mentioned, and a couple of other things, the undergrounding, some other things, that the reserve is not going to increase a whole lot based on some assumptions that I made in my mind, worst case, next year. So the question, and you can ask questions of Bill about this, or kind of a back and forth with some hypotheticals, but if the residents are willing, I guess my question is, rightly or wrongly in my own opinion right now, with the real preliminary numbers, would be if the residents are, with the assumptions, with legal and some other things, capital outlay, if they're willing to just freeze it, the residents will probably have to know if we have some skews, which we've had the last couple of years, the reserve will probably not increase next year, but would increase if we left the millage the same, the following years. Where we're going into 15, 16, 17. If the residents are you know, our constituents are like, you guys gotta really do something next year. We don't care that you've got the street lights, you've got this, you've got a couple of variables. We're really concerned with people. Get on it and do something next year. Then we've got some serious work to do, especially if no one in the town wants to raise the millage at all. And then you always have as a elected official, the issue is, well, that's a tax increase, you're raising taxes. Why are you raising taxes, and why do we need to, and do we want to pay for that as the resident, from the resident's perspective? So with kind of some internal assumptions, I'm like, well, it won't go up next year if you freeze the millage rate. You know, there's other ways to look at it, but that's just a real general view after what I sort of looked at in some preliminary discussions, so.
Yeah, that was my concern, is that the
Yeah.
rate was gonna have to increase because of the uncertainties, particularly with legal, but also with a number of the other emergency issues that can arise at a moment's notice. But I feel much more comfortable now with the elevated property valuations that just came in, and with 4001 and a couple other things. Bill has done his best to reduce costs, keep them trim, and it just seems to me that we should stay where we are, stay the course, if you will.
I agree with you, staying the course, but I also agree with you, with Tom, that we got work to do. And I think that you're absolutely right, there's not a crisis for which we need the help of our community in terms of better financial planning. Not necessarily better because somebody is helping with just more ideas. You talk about increasing revenues. There are about 10 things you can do to increase revenues. You know, we're thinking about property tax as one, but there are other ways that you can increase revenues in a town. And I think that once we have in mind what is it we need to increase revenues for, if it's just the reserves, but if whatever it is we need to press, then to be creative and figure out what are some ways we can do this in the best interest of the taxpayer, but at the same token, making sure that we can cover all of our expenses and live up to our commitments to, remain an independent community, preserve the historic purpose of why we are what we are. All the things that we can do require some thoughtful planning. Mrs. Orthwine at the last meeting said, kind of a 10-year plan. I'm big on that kind of thing. I really do think that creating a map that says where we want to be 10 years from now and what we have to do different in order to get to where we want to be is a constructive thing to do. And I do believe we can utilize the considerable resources of this community. And this is totally independent of setting this budget. This budget is to get us through the next year.
Mm-hmm.
But what we ought to be doing now is thinking about what do we need for 5 years down the road and 10 years down the road. And that's why I get back to water as an example. That's something that.
Well, as we mentioned,
Yeah.
under the reports,
Yep.
within 5 years, we are probably going to experience another fairly significant water line
Mhm.
issue. And that's going to have to be dealt with.
Mhm.
By reserves, probably not.
Mhm.
I can't imagine that we would have sufficient funds by then, but
Mhm.
perhaps we could. That's the big one we need to think about. Then, of course, there's the unknown EMS fire issue,
Yeah.
just looming
Yes,
out there.
absolutely.
We have no control over it at all, I don't believe. You had discussed the possibility of working with other communities in the barrier island. I'm wondering, given the fact that Delray is already considering this issue, whether there's sufficient time or interest in the other communities to really justify putting money into that study.
I do believe two things. One, I'm reasonably confident that Delray will not take a radical step in the direction of advocating its second highest expense item, which is the fire department. I mean, I don't think you're a great city and you give up an essential service and turn it over to somebody else. I don't think that's going to happen. But the pressures that would lead them to even consider it are such that eventually, as a service provider to us, they're going to have to pass along something to us. We have to assume that the cost of fire and EMS is not gonna go down. It's probably not gonna stay the same. It's probably gonna go up. And you budgeted it at, I didn't quite understand how you got to 7% when I think the contract is 5. What was the difference? Like timing?
The adjustment that we had to make,
Because of the pocket?
yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, for folks in the audience that aren't quite clear about that, when the pocket was brought in, we were double dipped. The county still charged us, and Del Rey had to charge us because they were in fact providing the service. So we were actually paying twice for fire service in the pocket. That's over, and that's obviously the difference, and I didn't know that, but still, that's a big nut. It's still an unknown, and we probably won't know what the outcome of that until after the budget has been established.
And it's not going to be static, as you say.
No,
That price is
no,
gonna go
that
up.
price is gonna go up regardless.
Bill, you've heard some of the comments. Do you want to pipe in with,
I would like to pipe in. I don't know where all I would go with my comments, but I've given this a great deal of thought and concern, and I believe that for the first time in my tenure over the last 18 to 24 months, that we have a rolling or moving financial responsibility or budget. There are more unknowns of material sizes than we, in my opinion, have ever faced. So I think that a continued effort at looking and analyzing on short-term periods other than just a budget is necessary, which in my mind, I believe that we do that. I would also tell you that I looked at our financial records as of September 30th, 2008, and I found something very complimentary to the commission at that time, that our fund balance was $2,499,966. That's in a time period when I had a hard time buying a chair in my office because it was still there, even though it was causing problems with my back. The coat was very, very tight. But we had $2.5 million. And we decided to forfeit a debt. We funded the water line, the utility enterprise fund. The town forgave that separate entity $1.4 million. What that did was that kept us out of outside debt, and we would still be paying on that loan today for several more years, maybe another 5 years. The accumulated interest of that loan is probably would have been around $200,000 to $250,000, depending on the interest rate. In addition to that, we stayed out of debt by paying our entire share of the utility assessment, almost $420,000. So there is an even flow in funds. One could argue that we had too much money back in September 2008. One could argue we have too little right now. I do believe that there is a lesson here. You can never have too much money in fund balance, in my opinion, in savings. So with that said, very complimentary to past commissions, but with that said, I do believe we did have some discussion, and Commissioner Orthwein can correct me, but I think we did say that we did, last year, we anticipated a big build in taxable value, and that we anticipated maintaining the millage rate. It is my strong recommendation that we maintain the 3.7 millage rate, not increase it nor decrease it. That's what we should have. And I think that as time goes on, and ideally we run the course of these legal challenges, which I am confident we will. Every breath in my body will work in that direction. And I think we have provided sufficient funds for next year. It could be wrong, but we're putting in $350,000 anticipated this fiscal year, and we're putting in $350,000 next fiscal year. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I know I feel comfortable with it, and that's, we cannot do that if we reduce the millage rate down. I will tell you that I think if all goes well, even with $350,000 in legal fees, that we will put money into the fund balance this fiscal year. That's the ideal. And the reason I say that is because we spread the cost of capital over 2 years for the lighting and the street signs. That was over $500,000. This year, in this current fiscal budget, we will only have to pay for 4 lights. That's just how the design of the electrical system went. So we won't utilize all that money. But then those numbers will change as every day goes by and we write a check. So I strongly believe in the millage rate that is suggested. I also lean towards the concept of freezing immediately. But I would like freezing not only this year, but freezing what we have proposed next year in certain line items till we feel comfortable. In other words, pushing those capital major expenditures that we control towards the end of the fiscal year, and to perhaps salvage that money and put that into our reserves, a function of net revenue, you know. So,
I'm sorry, explain to me what you're proposing.
not sure I'm saying that,
By freezing you.
oh, okay.
Certain.
You freeze until you absolutely must spend the money. You anticipate the project, but you freeze it till you absolutely have to use it. And if you don't need it, even at the end of next fiscal year, you let that flow into your net revenues as a surplus. It's there if you need it, and that's the whole purpose of the budget. You anticipate to the best of your ability that which you will expect to happen in the expenditure side. But slowing the pace down, keeping the funds in pocket as long as possible until, for example, we have a pothole on the road. Can't avoid that. Or we have a break in the drainage. Can't avoid that. Those are anticipated. But slowing it down, keeping the money in hand with an ideal concept that we will have net revenues, a positive performance of operation. That's how we got to 2.5 in reserves. Not spending it because it was there, but providing for it and analyzing at the time that you think you need to spend it, analyzing whether it can be extended.
What was 2.5 as a percent of our revenues in that era?
I believe it was almost 100%.
Okay, if you go to other commission meetings, you hear this debate at every budget meeting, what's the right amount? And the smaller you are, the more you need, simply because you're small and you can't, you can't go grab money from another account. Most of the people that are kind of most like us like to have 50% of operating revenues covered by reserves.
I think six
Delray,
months,
as an example, is
yeah.
all the way down now below 20%, and that's a big deal for them to drop. But obviously, that's still a lot more money because they're a much bigger community. And it's a philosophical thing, and every time we have our annual audit, the auditor will always say it's a policy decision by the commission as to what's the appropriate amount for your community. So there is no rule of thumb that you have to live with. We were trying to get back up to 50% at one point in time. And
Well,
it's kind of your call.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that's a goal.
Yeah.
You got a $3.5 million budget,
Mhm.
1.25
Yep.
is what
Yep.
you're saying. And I think that's consistent with historically what we wanted to do, at least. I've been looking at it.
I would argue that when you talk about the principle of freezing, that when we actually have our real budget discussions, would you give us a couple of examples
Sure.
of how that could be done? You know, delaying a pay increase by a couple of months.
Well, I'm not encouraging.
I knew it,
reduction
yes.
of pay rate at all. I'm slowing that part down. We must have the total
But, you know,
efforts of our employees.
if a car, in buying it in December instead of July, I mean, those are what I think what he's referring to, and I think the commission should have a better idea of what you have in mind as
If you
deferrable
isolate,
items.
if you isolate your time on the capital expenditures, I mean, that's primarily where I'm looking at. I also provide to you a 5-year projection on the fund balance, 5-year projection. I take all of the anticipated net performance, net revenues or losses, and roll them forward from year to year. So all of the numbers that you see in the summary items, or the first few pages, actually are shown, seen, used, visible in supporting documents at this time.
I think the history of the commission has always been that we want to fund our own expenditures. We don't want to go into debt, and it's served us very, very well in the past. And also capital expenditures, we've been looking at adding on to the town hall for years. Whether we get a plan to do it now or we put it off another year, it hasn't been a critical thing we have to do. So those are capital expenditures that we've looked at for years. But I think it's been the commission's decision not to go into debt, and that's how we funded everything ourselves. And I think it's served us well in the past. And I'm all into fund balance, you know, I'd love to have a big one. The more, because it's just security for us. When we get a hurricane or anything, we have an operating expense to go to.
We do some analysis in-house. It's not real fancy. It's very manual, but in regards to the water, that a very good indicator of what's going on in the water system is what is called a term referred to as water loss. It's that amount of water that goes through the system that is not actually billed, but we actually have to pay for. And prior to the replacement of the water main, we had water losses up to between 12 and 13%, if I remember correctly. Presently, our water losses are running less than 4%. And Mayor, Commissioner Orquine will remember that the water study that was performed for the town to determine rates said that a normal water life anticipation was 6%. So, as an indicator, when that water loss starts kicking up to 6 or greater than 6, we got a problem that we have to plan financially for.
That's right.
Oh, it looked like you wanted to say something.
No,
But just so people understand, part of the water loss is purposeful. When they flush the hydrants,
Oh, yeah.
that's water that goes literally down the drain.
That's all included in this.
That's included in the number.
Is that 4% been relatively constant
Since they did the.
since
redid
the
Since we did
last
the
Yeah.
water
repair?
main
Yeah.
on
So
A1A.
that's an encouraging sign for
Yes.
the health of our water.
But we do monitor it, we do calculate it, and we consider it in what we do.
I could just have an additional comment, which is global. Some of these line items I'm more familiar with than others, obviously, and got a few different line items, but for some reason I
have an answer for you right now, but,
for some reason I have this number in my head. You know, and again, this is a preliminary workshop, but the number, whether it's through freezing of capital outlays to push into the next year, or freezing of actual line items that are shown to increase for the new budget, whatever that may be. I would still like to see, and the number that's in my head is another 150,000 generated. If you look at the budget, that the pro forma that the town manager's provided today for 14-15, however you either find it or allocate it, I would feel more comfortable if we had another 150 coming from somewhere. Now, Bill may go back and look and say, well, your top line number is the same, I reallocated some categories, that's fine. Or you gotta cut somewhere or lower some line item in order to increase it to the other. I'm kind of unsure where we'll be with permits, you know, or we're kind of, it seems to me, of course, the town still has some construction, but it seems to be a lot of the permitting, and Bill's made an adjustment for that. That's one fee, could be 20, 30,000 different, we don't know. We do know a lot of projects are done. We do know that we do have renovations going all the time, which are rather significant, that don't involve what we call quote-unquote new construction. And then the other thing would be obviously the legal line item. We do have a copy of the bill, the package for the last month. Obviously, that's not the same every month. We made an adjustment for that to send to people what we might be at this year. That's uncertain. Engineering and other professionals, you know, I don't know that waivers, but you know, it could be 5,000 here, 10,000 there. You do also, either legal or other professional, you are planning on redoing the design code, not redoing it, making some amendments possibly, which is an expense I know that Bill has thought of, and you had the report earlier today. Sometimes when you change 3 things, you know, sometimes as a professional, I'm looking at those things in my own business. You think it's 5 hours and it's 25, and that's through no fault of either the staff or the attorneys or our outside professionals. And then obviously the other thing that I'm looking at is, which Bill kind of mentioned in freezing, was unanticipated expenses to these buildings. You know, whether that's under the capital outlay. You know, and the town manager, the finance director has thought of all these things. I'm just highlighting them again, and that's sort of where I'm at right now. I may be wrong. You may look at it and say, no, we've got this and this, and we're going to do that. But that's just sort of where I'm at, as a really conservative approach based on what we were presented today.
So you're looking at the capital outlay, which is budgeted at 70, and
Yeah.
per 200, 225.
Well, but it's at 70. I don't know if that's enough or not. You know.
At one
That was-
point in time, we talked about paying for the lighting over time, not paying, you know, cash upfront and thing like. Did that, this is my feeble memory, but was that ever resolved? The presumption here is that the money that you set aside in next year's plan fully funds the new lighting?
Correct.
Signs, okay.
Yeah, I think we had, I'm going back in my mind, we had some proposals, which also included financing.
Yeah.
I think we need.
There were sale leasebacks, but.
Yeah.
Well, we were gonna actually borrow from ourselves, because
Right.
we had
Yeah.
island funds,
Correct.
but because of the stagnation of the installation of the electric, there was no need to, borrow. There's four lights, we'll pay for them.
Sure, I
That's
understand,
included in.
I understand, but I mean, we're talking about ways that you could either freeze or extend cash outflows if we had to. I assume that's still an option.
Well, next year's obligation is March.
Yeah, because it's a lot, big number, and if it was paid out over time, you'd pay more absolute dollars, but.
Why would you pay it over time when we have the money?
That's the point. I'm just
That's always
saying,
been our
if
principle.
something comes up that we hadn't, Tom is trying to say, he's looking for $150,000. That, you know, if we had to deploy for something that's not in the budget next year, where would it come from? And that could have been one of the ways you could arrive at that. Next year doesn't start till October, so it's the first, so I mean, that's still decisionable, I gather.
But it doesn't appear we need to do that.
It doesn't appear we need to do it,
Why
but
encourage
I
finance
think
services?
that this commission should know what its options are.
But it's an option. you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Who knows what's gonna happen?
Just personally, I think it's always good to increase things gradually instead of a big hit. We tend to have a big hit last year, but I think it's in the past, I think we've done things more gradually to build up it doesn't seem to hurt as much. People don't, you know, it's something you just can take on, instead of taking such a big,
And
Um,
you see that in the presentation of the millage rate
yeah.
from year to year. There's a 25-year history of the combined, of the millage rate for our town, so that confirms it's consistent with that schedule.
Well, once again, we say this every time, but let's remind ourselves that our greatest asset is the value of our community. And building the value of the community is essentially what, you know, we're all trying to do. And the millage is really, the fact of the matter is, you are paying more money, but you're not paying a higher percent of what the value of your property. And it's great to live in a town as we do, where the values consistently run ahead of our neighbors in terms of, we made it through a recession better than most. We'll probably do better as the economy expands, as long as we stay faithful to who we are and why we're such a desirable place to want to live.
That's a very good point, and I think it's why we try to hold so true to the code, frankly. From what I understand from talking to Bill, is that our property valuation went up considerably higher than our neighbors. And it has to be because of the uniqueness of our town. And that's just all the more incentive for us to stay true to this mission.
Amen.
I have one question, Bill. Does this account for an additional policeman?
No,
Okay,
that's 11 and a half officers.
okay.
I'm sorry, 11 and a part-time officer.
Okay. Because that has been an ongoing issue. I just want to make everyone aware of it, that in the past that we had promised, the commission had promised an additional officer years and years ago to make things work better for the chief. I just want to bring that up because it's going to be part of our budget.
Well stated.
Well, we currently have 11 and a half officers.
Right.
11 and one
That's how
part-time.
they do it.
Yeah.
But we had a code
I mean, we're
officer.
splitting hairs. I just want everyone to be aware of it might come up, and it was something that was given consideration in the past.
The 1 year we had the salary overlap for training,
Yeah.
wasn't that 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, oh, yes,
Yeah, I mean,
That's
that's
caused the
always,
numbers
that's
to-
standard due to the
to
protocol.
project higher than anticipated. Because we brought in additional officers in the training period 3 months early, so in that interval, you're actually paying for 2 officers that you anticipated having 1.
Mhm.
Joan, your memory is good on these things.
Well,
Are there other topics that we should be?
I think everything's pretty good right now. Just the building and the policemen, I think, you know, and getting back to fund balance. And increases taxes over, you know, a little bit at a time, not, the big hit is hard, I think, for people. I think it's much easier.
I don't want to belabor it, I think everybody's ready to go, but I think some discussion should be had, perhaps not here, but code enforcement officer hiring or contractually may be important to our town in the 2014-15 budget.
I don't think that sort of discussion should take place. We're talking about need here for an ad hoc committee, and I know all of this discussion has related to that, and you are going to have budget hearings at a later time, so.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful, when are the budget hearings, just so that people here know when this actually, I mean, this is pretty unusual, I think, to, you know, go into this level of detail prior to even a first submission of a,
Well, our whole situation financially is
Yeah,
unusual,
right,
so
that's right.
it
So I'm not-
It's actually been
requires.
it's been very helpful
Yeah.
and very good, at least from my standpoint, frankly. But the earlier that the town focuses on the budget, particularly in these times of some fiscal challenge, all the better.
And we won't know the dates until we know when the school board's going to be having their dates.
Well, we know that we have to have a proposed budget figure by the end of July. So,
Proposed millage rate.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
proposed millage.
Proposed not to exceed millage rate. And
Right.
once that's in there, that's it.
No, you can always go down.
You can
can't
always go down,
up.
you can't go up. So
happen?
it's a very
You can't go
critical
up.
day.
Documents.
And there is some gamesmanship every once in a while among some communities who are not quite sure where they are, and they put in a number, and then they, you know, they work it back. We've been very, very good about putting in a number that, you know, we believe is the right number. And if it's a tad too high, we'll cut it back, but I think it would be being prudent here, we should put in whatever number we think is absolutely the right number.
Yeah, we should get a certified taxable value certificate from the property appraiser around the 1st of July, and that's when the timeline begins to really take force.
Historically, what has been the difference between the preliminary and certified, 1%, 2%?
No, not that much,
Not
but
that
typically, the estimated number that we presently have been given, which is 862.5 million taxable value, typically that is on the low side, slightly on the low side of the real certified number, but not material.
Anything else any of the commissioners want to bring up? Or Bill, if you'd like to bring up?
I'm finished.
If not, I think it's been very helpful. Appreciate you all spending the extra time. Meeting's clear.
I can take it off, 'cause I was gonna take it. Yeah.